The next speaker we have is Adam Hady. He's the Extension Ag Agent for Richland County, and he's going to be talking about composting livestock, mortalities. So with that, I'll put Adam on. Thank you.
Thanks, Otto. As Otto said, my name's Adam Hady. I'm the Ag Agent down in Richland County, so I'm Otto's counterpart in the southwest part of the state of Wisconsin. And I'm here to talk to you today about the successful methods for efficient and safe composting of mortalities. So basically, we're all in the livestock business, right? So unfortunately, at some point in livestock, you end up with dead stock. So what do we do with dead stock? So starting off here. First thing we have to know when we do have a mortality, we have some obligation and responsibilities for livestock disposal. And I think we skipped over a slide here. Yep. So in the state of Wisconsin, we actually have a time frame when livestock or our mortalities have to be taken care of. So it's 24 hours in April through November. So in the summertime, it makes sense. We should get rid of these animals in a more efficient manner. We all know, all driven down the side of the road, and we've seen deer that have been hit there and they've been sitting there for a while. We don't need that on our farms. We need to take care of them in an appropriate manner. However, we get into our winter months, we get a little bit of a break. We have 48 hours by state law to take care of those animals. We have a few options. We have rendering, so the dead truck that comes through. We have burial, we have burning, landfilling, and composting. So there's advantages and disadvantages to all of these. And today we're going to focus on composting. The one method that does get used sometimes, and I'm not saying that anybody in here would ever do that, but there is what I call the back 40 method. Years ago, we used to drag them to the back corner of the woods or the back 40, throw some lime on them, and let them sit out there and let the scavengers take care of them or whatnot. That is illegal. We don't want to encourage scavenging on our property. I mean, the next part of this conference today, we'll be talking about predators. And if there's a better way to start attracting predators, it's by leaving our animal carcasses there. Also, we want to make sure that we're not contaminating any well or waterways. We want to make sure that we're taking care of the mortalities in a efficient manner, because generally there's a reason that they died, and it usually is connected with some kind of disease pathogen transfer, and we want to make sure that we take care of that as well. So we're going to talk about composting. And composting isn't just throwing them in a pile, let them sit there and it'll be taken care of. Okay? So composting is an aerobic recycling process. So that means we're going to use oxygen. These are bacteria that like oxygen. They're going to break down the organic material so that the animal itself will be broke down in a controlled environment. So this controlled environment is really key to the composting process. How are we managing this pile? There is work and effort into it. It's not just throw it in a pile. We'll come back at some point and we'll have the animal completely broke down. But we want to end up at the end with a stable product that we call humus, and that we can actually apply back to our fields in a safe manner. So composting really is bacteria farming, okay? So we don't think, we always think of our traditional farming. We got our livestock, we got our crops. Well, when we're dealing with composting, we're really looking at providing bacteria with the environment to grow properly. So we have these kind of three different levels. That we have our general bacteria, and they come for about 80 to 90% of the decomposition activity, and they generate heat. Okay, so these are bacteria that love to live in warm environments. They break down sugars, starches, proteins, and fats, and start on the cellulose production or breakdown, so that really tough material. We have the actinomyces. I'm really bad at saying that word, but we got through it. And so you'll see it from now on. I'll just say the A bacterias. They're another level order of bacteria that help in the second step. So they start helping break down some of that tougher tissue. And then finally we get to our fungi state. And it's very similar. They start breaking down that cellulotic materials. So break down the bones, the tendons, all that really tough stuff in the animal. So some of our advantages to composting is biosecurity. It's a quick, efficient manner. We don't have the dead truck coming onto our place. We don't have anybody else coming onto our place. So we're not bringing somebody else's diseases there. And we're taking care of our own issues in-house. It's environmentally friendly. You're not leaving nutrients not leaving your place. You're able to put it back out on your own farms. When done right, and I will stress this, when done right, it's low odor, so it doesn't have some of the associated smells that we might think of when we talk about decomposing mortalities. Again, while properly managed, we can destroy the pathogens, weed seeds, and other insect eggs. So we can be using some of our older feedstocks that we want to get rid of in this process, and we can kind of kill two birds with one stone and actually have a stable and clean product to put back out on our fields. And again, provide stable nutrient that can be returned to the farm. There are disadvantages to it, though. If everything in farming had pure advantages, we'd be a lot better off, right? So we got to look what are some of the disadvantages. There's definitely a cost to it. The cost can be prohibitive, and it could be an advantage depending on your management system. Labor, as we look at things, said it's a controlled system, right? It's a managed system, so anytime you're managing something, there's also labor that goes into that. So we have some labor that we have to look at. There's monitoring and maintenance. You don't just, like I said at the beginning, it's not just putting them in a pile and you don't look at it till you're ready to incorporate it. And then finally, do we have space to incorporate it? How do we incorporate the compost itself? So that's kind of the quick and dirty of why we should. But now let's start looking at the different elements, because we said it's a management system, right? So in a managed system, we have these separate elements. So the first element that we have to deal with is moisture. And, we talk about the amount of water that's in live tissue. It's over 70% of the body's water. So we have to manage this moisture. But inside this total pile, we want the moisture to be at about a 40 to 60% moisture range. So if we have a pile that's too dry within there, we don't get enough moisture for adequate bacterial growth. So the bacteria doesn't have enough moisture to grow and expand. And if they're not growing, we slow down that decomposition rate. Flip side, we get it too wet, right? We start to close the pores. We said that we want oxygen in this system. We start putting this into a anaerobic digestion system, so it's a whole different set of bacteria that come into play. We have slower decomposition time, and then we can also start to get some odors associated with the pile. So how do you know? You're going to take a moisture out there every time and look at your compost pile and see if you're at the right level. There's kind of a rule of thumb, test feel. Have you guys ever taken a soils class? You used to make ribbons with the soil. You can kind of do the same thing with compost. You take a handful and you squeeze it, right? If it doesn't come together, clump together, it's too dry. If you squeeze it and there's water dripping out, you're too wet. But if you can make that nice, just clump, it's almost like the kids playing in the mud a little bit, If they got something that they can make something out of, that's about where you need it to be. So we want to look at it just by that hand feel. So we want just a little bit of water to come out, but we don't want too much. But this one is the real key to our whole process, is this carbon-nitrogen balance. Said we're farming bacteria, right? So these are the two elements that bacteria need to grow. So our carbon and nitrogen are the two main ingredients, and our optimal ratio is 25 to 1. So composting occurs as low as 10 to 1 and as high as 50 to 1. If we have high ammonia odors, it's caused by not enough or too low a carbon and nitrogen ratio within the mix. So when we're looking at how do we manage this ratio, what are some of the things we need to look at? So this is where we start looking at what we call our co-compost or bulking materials. So what are we making this pile of, right? We know we have the dead mortality. That's giving us what element? It's giving us the nitrogen element out of our ratio. So now we need to find what carbon sources to add to the pile to help with the composition. So we need to, provide carbon. The other things that come into play with what are you going to pick is how does it give structure to the pile, right? We need oxygen to be able to get into the pile, so we need some structure. We need to provide a cover, a casting over this pile so that we're not allowing predators to come in. We also have a lot of liquid, right, that's coming from the center of the pile, and we don't want any leachate coming out. So what are the absorptive properties of the composting material as well? So when we're considering what we're going to put into the pile for our carbon source, what is the availability? What do we have available to us? What are the costs to it? Carbon to nitrogen levels, moisture properties, and particle size. So structure becomes also important. So the structure size, that 1/4 of an inch to an inch, is kind of where we want some of the particle size to be. And here we can see this is just a chart that came from the On-Farm Composting Handbook, but it just lists some materials down through there and their carbon to nitrogen ratios. We look at typical things that we might find on farm that we might use for co-compost. Anybody have a old pile of corn silage or something that kind of got a little bit spoiled that we don't want to feed anymore? It's a pretty common one that's 38-40 to 1. We look at some of the literature. A lot of people talk about using sawdust. It's very absorbent. We look at a 200 to 750 to 1. Very variable depending on if you're getting it dry sawdust versus wet sawdust. So there's a lot of different things to consider here. But as you're going through, look at what the different carbon sources are. And we have a lot of things like straw and corn silage, corn stalks especially, that are on farm already that might be cheap alternatives for us as well. So as we look at those, we talked about the structure because oxygen is very important. The compost uses, again, anaerobic decay. And so those bacteria and fungi need that oxygen to reproduce. It can get pretty low levels of oxygen. We can go down to about 5% needed to keep the decomposition going. And so when we start figuring out how are we managing this, what are some indicators that our pH might be, or our oxygen might be a little off, is we start to get odors associated in low pH with too little oxygen. So if your pile really starts to stink, we might have to start aerating it. The other thing is if we aerate it too much, we can cool the pile significantly, so it becomes a management system. So we talked about pH being a little bit of an indicator for our pile management. So we want to be as close to 7 as possible with a range of 5 to 10. But temperature is really going to be our management measurement as we go through the system, okay? We want the heat ranges in the pile to be 110 to 150 degrees. These are where these bacteria really like to work, and this is where the faster the pile reaches those temperatures, the more efficient the composting becomes. So as we measure these temperatures, the pile needs to heat up to 131 degrees for 3 consecutive days to kill pathogens. And in a little bit later here, we'll talk about managing the temperature and what that can tell us as far as pile management. So those are the key elements. I just want to show you some work that was done in Arlington. This was done in 2001, 2002. So it's a little bit older, but you can definitely see how simple these structures really can be. It doesn't have to be an elaborate covered roof or anything, but there's a lot of options here. But what they did is they set up these different cells. So they had 4 cells. Cell 1 was just their feedstock. So they were using sawdust. This was just a sawdust pile. There wasn't really anything in there. In cell 2, they had a cow, and they had it in the straw treatment. In cell 3, they had a cow and sawdust treatment. And then cell 4, there was a calf bin, so in some mixing area. So we're going to look at some of the different data points from that demonstration. So this is just to talk about how fast those piles can heat up, okay? So as we look in here, this was a 1,350 pound cow. It was placed in the pile at 8/7, so the beginning of August. 10 days later at 8/17, the temperature in the pile had already reached 133 degrees. So it stayed above 130 degrees almost till the first part of September. So 9/6 is when it kind of started to drop down in temperature between 9/6 and 9/16. So really we had this really nice good month of really warm, fast digestion, right? And then the temperature kind of slopes down. You can kind of see there by the middle of October, you're sitting at about a temperature of 108. So as that temperature starts to level off in that hundreds is when we're going to start thinking about possibly turning the pile. We'll talk a little bit more about that. So this one was the calf bin, and there's two charts. The top chart is actually the temperature chart for the calf bin, just like we did with the cows. And you can kind of see there's some up and down, but it definitely has this nice shaped curve to it. If you were to draw kind of a line through there, you can see where it's nice curved. And so the real comparison here that I want to highlight is the bottom is the precipitation that they had during that same time frame. So one of the concerns becomes, okay, yes, we get this nice heating, it's August, but what happens during rain events? Is that cool? How much does that cool the pile? You know, is there these big variations and swings depending on the external happenings of the pile? So we can see in the beginning, 8-10, right away, kind of close to the beginning here, there was an inch of rain. So if I can just kind of get my cursor over here, if you guys can see this, going across here, you know, here's about that ½ inch of rain. So there's some significant rainfalls that are happening on top of these piles during this time frame, and really had no real effect on the temperature inside the core of that pile. So by building these pretty, by using the right compost material and having that structure, we can really maintain those temperatures within the pile itself. So they also logged what kind of bacterial growth was happening in there. So we can see this is just kind of the time going across there. If we look, the dotted green line is the temperature. So we can see that we definitely had some increase in temperature there. So as we had that increase in temperature, we also had that blue line kind of follow that green line. So these are the populations of that first level bacteria that we talked about. Okay. So they were doing kind of their thing right away at that beginning. So you can see, you know, we kind of get out, we get two little waves there, and then it kind of matches up the fungi and the A bacteria that I talked about earlier. They start to match up, and actually the fungi grow a little bit better than a regular bacteria to finish off that composting process. So you can kind of see how those three tiers of bacteria that we talked about at the beginning work into the system and their growth patterns. So this was that August cow in that sawdust pile. So this was 9 months later in May. So it composted through the winter. It was turned a couple of times. But what you can start to see here is, you know, get my cursor over here. So we have a big bone here. We have a big bone here. But there's no tissue what's to speak of, you know. I mean, we're really now just looking at the bigger, harder bones. So this was a 1,350 pound cow. So it's not like there was a lot of soft bone tissue there. We're talking about some harder tissue. So we start to get some serious, pretty much everything is gone except for the bones. They're starting to get brittle at this point. We can further put them into the composting process, and some of the data that I've seen shows that if you took this out to a full 2 years, you wouldn't have even the femur bones left. With mixing them in the proper piles. So we can get rid of them depending on when you want to complete that process. So what are some of the equipment that we're going to need? We said it's a managed system, right? So the first thing we need to have is some kind of equipment for loading and turning the pile. So typically these are skid steers, front end loaders, some way that we can move carcasses, move bulking material, mix the compost and turn it into a finished product. The second one here is a 3-foot temperature probe. And we want a 3-foot temperature probe because we're making a fairly substantial size mound, right? So if we want to monitor temperature, temperature is going to be our key indicator for how the activity, microbial activity in the pile is working. We want to get into close to the center of that pile as we can. So having that 3-foot probe allows us to take temperatures within the middle of the pile. The second one, or the third one up here, is a lancing tool. So a lancing tool is, well, why would you need this? Well, as we're building the pile, it's suggested that you would lance the rumen prior to completely filling in the pile. Again, we've all seen that deer on the side of the road in August. You know how that expands with the gases within the cavity. If we lance that animal prior to that, it allows for the release of the expansion, and we don't degrade the structure of the pile itself from gas buildup, and it also encourages faster decomposition because now we're also allowing some of the rumen bacteria to move out into the pile as well. A logbook, again, we said that this is a managed system, so just about every extension recommendation will tell you guys the record keeping is coming into play some point, right? And we all know how much everybody loves paperwork, but it really does give you an opportunity to monitor when is my pile really starting to drop in temperature, is it time to aerate it? And if you have this logbook, you start looking at the pile and looking at different things that, for structure and that type of thing. And then there's just some miscellaneous tools suggested, you know, if you do have a kind of a composting area, that maybe you have a set of pitchfork and shovels and some of those things that are just designated for that area, so you're not dragging them to other parts of the farm as well for biosecurity. So we saw some demonstrations, but what do these structures really look like? So the first one here is, we have basically 3 different options here. We have compost bins, and these can be anything. So you can see in the picture here, they've taken some old round bales, made a little square, and this is what they're going to use for a bin. Prior to my work with Extension, I worked in the poultry industry. We had some people there that were building concrete walled bins. There's tub tumblers as bins. So there's a lot of different composting bins that can be built. So you can put a lot of money. You can put roofs and everything over them. But basically a bin, we're just taking a certain amount of area that allows us to minimize the space and actually build up within and contain the material. We have static piles, and so these would be essentially like this bin, except for we wouldn't have any walls around them per se. And so these would just be a mound basically. And then windrow composting, this is typically what's done if you had, say, more of a a major health outbreak where you had lots of mortalities at once. You end up making like that static pile, but it gets extended out in a long windrow and allows you to manage multiple mortalities as you move forward. So when if you're going to put in some compost bins or piles or windrows, there's really kind of this long site checklist for facilities. We want to avoid wet areas, right? We want it to be kind of that high and dry. We don't want anything spilling over into our water streams, waterways. We want to divert. We don't want to be in clean water areas. We want to make sure that we're at least 3 feet above high water tables. And I'm not real familiar with the water tables up here, but I did see a lot of water as I was coming in. So my guess is there's certain areas in the county that the water level's pretty high. So you want to make sure that you're hitting that above 3 feet above the water table. You want to put it 300 feet from streams, ponds, lakes, or drainage areas. Again, we're really trying to protect the environment, because one of the reasons we're doing this is it does have a benefit, but we don't want to make it a detriment as well. Weather access. So we talked about those big bones, right? That was 9 months to a year that we're going to have these piles on there, and we have some management system that we have to take care of. So can we access where we're going to put the piles with our end loaders to turn the pile if it needs to be turned in the winter? Is it really hard to get to that place because we have mud in the spring? So we need to take in consideration, what is our access? Do we have suitable storage? So if we're using sawdust, do we have some old feedstuffs that we're going to separate out because we don't really want to mix our feedstuffs with our compost stuff by our feedstuffs, because we don't want to be commingling and running through areas to try to transmit disease. Farm traffic in general, we kind of want to put these in an area that they're kind of, once we set them, we can kind of let them be, we can monitor them, but we don't have to run into them on a daily basis. Consider prevailing winds. I don't know if any of you guys got neighbors, but sometimes if the pile isn't quite working right, there are some odors that are produced, and we want to make sure that we keep our neighborly relations. And just the aesthetics and landscaping. My guess is up here with a lot of tourists driving through to get to the lakes and waterways. Probably right next to Highway 53 is probably not the best place to have your composting piles and your mortality issues out for everybody to see. We just want to make sure that we keep it aesthetically pleasing for everyone. So we picked the site. we've got all these elements that we're going to look at. So how do we construct it to make sure that it's doing its job effectively? So the first thing we do is we start with a base. And we may be using different materials for different parts of this. So the base, we want something that's going to be sound and absorbent, right? Because the water's going to leach down. So this is what we're going to put the livestock on, the mortality on top of. So we want about 24 inches, 18 to 24 inches of material in a bed big enough that we can place the mortality in the center, and you have about 2 feet around that mortality. So this is a considerable amount of material that we're using. So when you look at the total volume of this pile, it's about 12 cubic yards. So it's a pretty good sized pile when it's all said and done. The mortality, we want to place it in the center of that base, 24 inches from the edges again, and then we want to build this blanket or cover. So it can be 12 to 24 inches over the top of the mortality, and we want to make sure that we shape it, right? So just before we're putting on this blanket or cover, again, we want to lance that mortality, and then we want to start shaping this blanket or cover, and we want to use the co-compost. Here we want something with a little more structure maybe than we had on the base layer. So ones that come up here, a lot of people will use, say, some corn silage, for example, becomes pretty popular. Some sawdust, some mixed manure a little bit in here, because we already have some added nitrogen, we have some moisture, we also have some start of bacterial growth. Also, if you have continuing compost piles, using a little bit of that compost from one pile that's almost finished, as almost like a starter culture in the pile, really can help accelerate the pile itself. So once we get the pile all managed, built, we want to start checking the pile regularly. I don't know about you guys, but every time I've never built a perfect mound of material that stayed the same 2 months later. So when we're checking this pile, we want to make sure we're not having flat spots in it. We want to make sure that the mound stays fairly uniform. So we start monitoring temperature. And you saw on that earlier graph, temperature kind of has this nice little bell shape. And then the one with the bacterial growth, we saw kind of a bump in temperature again. When the temperature gets down to about that 110 degrees, it's a good indication that might be a time that we want to turn the pile or add some air into that pile. So that temperature kind of tells us that the temperature's getting a little bit low, so the bacteria aren't growing as well for us. We need to add a little oxygen into the system. So we might turn and reshape that pile, and then we should get another spike in temperature. So that first one is going to probably take us about 4 to 9 months, somewhere in there, depending on temperature outside and some of those other things. But then we're going to turn that pile by monitoring the temperature. When we turn that pile, then we should see another spike in temperature, and we're going to do this every couple of months until we really don't see much of a spike in our temperature anymore, and then we know that we have a completed composted product. So when we're monitoring it, though, we're going to have some problems. So these are our troubleshooting guides, and this came right off the Department of Ag's website. So if you guys want this troubleshooting site or list, it's right there. But improper temperature. So we're just not getting the temperatures we think we should. So what are some of the causes? Is it too wet, too dry? Is our carbon to nitrogen ratios, are they matching up? Especially when we get into that second and third heating. Sometimes we might not get the heating that we're expecting to get. If we had a really successful first round, we might have eaten up a lot of our nitrogen source. So we may have to add some nitrogen source back into the system. And one of the simplest ways to do that is if any of you have a bedded pack system, you just add some manure back in there, because you're going to get the nitrogen out of the cattle manure to help boost those bacteria again. Odors. Again, we talked about that too wet and moving from aerobic to anaerobic digestion, and that will increase the odors. Flies. It's one of the things that we really don't think of, but if we construct these piles adequately, we're going to have some flies around the pile, but there shouldn't be large volumes of flies, and also our scavenging. So when we talk about those two, pile management becomes a real concern, because there might not be enough cover, and we want to make sure that we have those piles to the point where we're not attracting unwanted critters. So this is great. We're doing a lot of stuff. We find the environmental part of it. Now, is it really cost effective? Okay. We just talked, there's lots of materials that you can use, lots of different things. So what happened here is university in Canada, they set out to determine the efficiency and stability of using sawdust, corn silage, and solid manure in composting mortalities on feed yards. So what they did is they took 2 sites. So they had 2 sites in southwestern Ontario, and they just wanted to go over the normal mortality. So they actually set up 6 bins on each of these sites, and their bins were very similar to the ones you saw at Arlington. They were just made from bales, so there wasn't a lot of concrete and mortar type bins, but they used bale systems. Both these feedlots finished out about 1,000 to 1,500 cattle a year. So I mean, they weren't extremely large, but they're good size. So they have fairly regular mortalities, and they wanted to look at how these composting substrates were affecting the composting rate. So you can see here, this is site 1 and site 2, and they each had their 6 bins, and as you look at the dates, they weren't filled all at the same time. So these are truly utilizing on-farm mortalities. They weren't trying to load it. So the first, but you look on average, the second column, or this column here, this column right here, this was their first mixing time. So you can see it was about 6 months before they mixed their piles for the first time, and then when they did their final mixing. So they were running anywhere from about 10 to 12 months. So they were going through almost a full year with the piles. Some a little longer, some a little less. So this table here, this shows site 1. Site 1 had 21 carcasses that they said went through their system. So we look at the table. So this was their base. So they put in a base of 25 to 30 centimeters. So we look about that, it's about a foot is what they were putting down for a base. And then the next row here is the approximate weight of first animals. So they were loading a couple animals in each bin at a time. And so when we look at this, these are all in kilograms. So we look at the 500, 522, that's about 1,100 pounds. So it kind of gives you an idea about how big some of these animals were that they were loading into the bin. Then they put a second layer in the depths of substrate. So they actually layered mortalities on top of each other. And then they hit a bunch of these 295s. And so the 295s in this one, they're actually also utilizing some slaughter waste. So the 295s were offal and things from a slaughter plant that they were also utilizing in their compost bins. So it was just a different, so they basically had their mortality, and then they would put a layer of co-compost, and then they would put some slaughter waste, and then they would top it off with the 60 centimeters, or about 2 feet of substrate over to cap their piles in the bins. Farm 2 obviously didn't put nearly as many animals into theirs, and they were a lot more consistent and even throughout their loading. So, you know, there was only 12 carcasses put into the 6 bins here. So just to kind of show you how use and management affect the bottom line of the bins. So costs associated. So when they did the economic analysis, they had to set some guidelines for what each farm suggested that they had for cost. So they built bales, right? So they used straw bales for their bins. So they figured $15 per bale for their bin construction, $6 per square meter for sawdust. The one farm said, I'm not going to charge anything for my corn silage. It was spoiled. I wasn't going to be able to use it anyways. I'd either have to put it back out on the field or do something with it. So I can use it in this system, but I'm not going to put a dollar value because it would have been waste for us anyways. And then they also valued manure at $2.50 a square meter. Site 2, again, used bales construction. They had a little bit higher cost per bale. They charged themselves $20. Their sawdust was $25 a ton. Corn silage, they charged $25 a ton too, and then about the same for manure costs, and then the labor costs were $12 an hour, and then they figured $50 an hour for machinery and operator costs throughout the system. So what does that mean? So they took the cost there for site 1 and site 2. So to build their bins cost them about $60 per bin. Labor was about $10. So we look down through this, we get to the point here where we get total cost for the bin is $161.80 for site 1 and roughly $250 for site 2. Okay, so what some of the major differences that come here is obviously one charged for the corn silage, one didn't. So depending on how you look at your cost for these bins, there can be some drastically different costs per bin. What they did then was compared, okay, so if the rendering truck charged me $55 an animal to pick up, or $100 per animal to pick up, what does that tell me? In the case of site 1, if pickup was $55 per animal, it was more efficient for them to use the compost bins. It was cheaper for their operation. If site 2, it was definitely much cheaper for them to use the rendering truck than it would be to use their costs for composting during this particular year. And this was 2006, I believe. So what that really tells me, though, is management becomes key factor. And is this really a economically viable option for me? And is it something you want to do? I will say, though, at the end part of the study, when they talked about some of the acknowledgments and some of the other things that come out of here, one of the things that the farms indicated that they liked the composting better, and even the one that was losing money compared to the rendering truck was going to continue to do that because they felt that they were able to manage their dead animals a lot faster and more efficiently, and that they were able to return the nutrients back to the soil. So there was some real positives beyond just the cost that they felt was worth continuing with the composting. So in conclusions, these are some environmentally sound practices. When I talk about quick disposal time of the mortalities, it's not necessarily the quick time to get it broke down, but how fast you can, from the point when you find the animal, the mortality, to the time when you actually can contain the mortality is extremely quick. Can it be cost effective? It may or may not be, as we saw in the last one. There's some positives there as well. There's opportunities here. We can utilize the nutrients and some of the things we have right on farm as an alternative way to manage our mortalities on livestock farms. And we all know that the regulations and laws are getting stricter and stricter about what rendering trucks are able to take. So we may have to be looking at new options for us in the future. So here's a list of references and resources, and all of you should have got a sheet of paper at the front that has these resources at the end of it as well. And with that, do you guys have any questions?